My parents neglected me my entire life while focusing all their attention on my sister. So when I asked my grandparents to walk me down the aisle instead of them, they tried to ruin my wedding by messaging all the guests telling them not to come. Hello everyone. My name is Sophia. I'm 29 years old. And today I'm going to tell you about how my parents, who ignored and neglected me my entire life while pouring all their love and attention into my sister, tried to sabotage my wedding when I chose my grandparents to walk me down the aisle instead of them. This is a story about lifelong favoritism, about finally standing up for yourself and choosing the people who actually loved you, and about vindictive parents who would rather ruin your happiness than accept the consequences of their own neglect. I never imagined my wedding would turn into a battleground, but sometimes setting boundaries with toxic family members brings out their absolute worst behavior. Let me start by explaining the family dynamic I grew up in, because understanding the history is crucial to understanding why I made the decision I did about my wedding. I'm the older child by 3 years, and from the moment my sister Vanessa was born, it became clear that she was the favored child, the golden child who could do no wrong while I became essentially invisible. I don't have a dramatic story of abuse or overt cruelty to tell. Instead, I have a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as less important than my sister in 1,000 small ways that added up to a childhood where I never felt truly seen or valued by my parents when we were kids. Vanessa got the birthday parties with all her friends invited while I got family dinners. Vanessa got dance lessons, piano lessons, art classes, whatever she expressed interest in, while I was told we couldn't afford lessons for both of us and I should find free hobbies. When we both brought home report cards, Vanessa's B's were celebrated and praised while my A's were met with "that's nice, honey," before attention returned to Vanessa. My school events were frequently missed because they conflicted with something of Vanessa's, but my parents never missed anything Vanessa participated in. I learned early that in our family hierarchy, Vanessa was the priority and I was the afterthought. As we got older, the favoritism became even more pronounced. When I got into a prestigious university on a partial scholarship, my parents were pleased but said they couldn't afford to help with the remaining costs because they needed to save for Vanessa's education. I worked multiple jobs through college, took out loans, and graduated with significant debt. When Vanessa got into a decent but not exceptional state school 3 years later, my parents paid for everything, bought her a car, set her up in an apartment, and gave her a generous monthly allowance. When I pointed out the disparity, I was told that circumstances were different, that they were in a better financial position now, and I should be happy my sister wasn't struggling like I had after college. I built a successful career in marketing through hard work and determination. I met my now husband James when I was 25, and we built a beautiful relationship based on mutual respect and genuine love. My parents were barely interested in my relationship, rarely asking about James or making effort to get to know him. Meanwhile, Vanessa dated a series of losers, and each new boyfriend was welcomed into the family like visiting royalty. My parents hosting dinners and making efforts to bond with whoever Vanessa was seeing at the moment. Regardless of how obviously unsuitable they were, the people who were actually present and supportive throughout my life were my maternal grandparents, Nana and Papa, while my parents were focused on Vanessa. My grandparents made sure I knew I was loved and valued. They came to my school events that my parents missed. They celebrated my achievements. They helped me financially when I was struggling through college even though they didn't have much to give. They were the ones who asked about my life, remembered details about my friends and interests, and made me feel like I mattered. They embraced James immediately, welcoming him to family dinners and genuinely getting to know him. In every way that counted, my grandparents were more my parents than my actual parents ever were. When James proposed last year, I was overjoyed. We started planning a wedding for the following summer, a celebration with about 150 guests at a beautiful venue we'd fallen in love with. As the planning progressed, I had to make decisions about traditional wedding roles, including who would walk me down the aisle. The expected choice would be my father, but every time I imagined that moment, I felt nothing but resentment. Why should my father get the honor of giving me away when he'd barely been present in my life? Why should he get to participate in this meaningful moment when he'd missed or dismissed so many other meaningful moments over the years? I talked to James about my feelings, and he was completely supportive of whatever I decided. He knew my history with my parents, had witnessed their favoritism toward Vanessa firsthand, and understood why I might not want my father in that traditional role. After a lot of thought, I decided to ask both my grandparents to walk me down the aisle together, one on each side. They'd been the ones who truly raised me in the ways that mattered, who had shown up consistently, who had loved me unconditionally. It felt right and meaningful to have them escort me to marry the man I loved. When I asked my grandparents, they were both moved to tears. Nana hugged me and said it would be the honor of her life. Papa got choked up and said he was proud to stand beside me on my wedding day. Their genuine emotion and joy at being asked reinforced that I was making the right decision. These were people who actually valued the privilege of being part of my life. Unlike my parents who had taken their relationship with me for granted for 29 years, the difficult part was telling my parents about my decision. I invited them to lunch specifically to discuss wedding planning, and after some small talk, I told them that I had made a decision about the processional. I explained as gently as I could that I had asked Nana and Papa to walk me down the aisle, that they had been the parental figures who had been consistently present in my life, and that I wanted to honor them in this way. I tried to frame it positively, focusing on my grandparents rather than my parents' failings, but the message was clear regardless. My father's reaction was immediate anger. He said it was ridiculous and disrespectful, that he was my father and it was his right to walk me down the aisle, that I couldn't just give his role to someone else because of some perceived slight. My mother was crying, saying I was being cruel and punishing them, that this was her dream to see her daughter get married with her father walking her down the aisle. I tried to explain that this wasn't about punishment, that it was about honoring the people who had actually been there for me. But they weren't interested in understanding my perspective. The conversation deteriorated quickly. My father demanded I change my decision, saying that if my grandparents walked me down the aisle, he and my mother wouldn't attend the wedding at all. My mother said I was being manipulated by my grandparents, that they had probably put ideas in my head about my parents being inadequate, and that I was too blind to see it. When I pointed out specific examples of their favoritism toward Vanessa over the years, they dismissed every example as me being oversensitive or misremembering events. I left that lunch upset but firm in my decision. If my parents couldn't understand why I wanted my grandparents to walk me down the aisle, that was their problem, not mine. I wasn't going to change one of the most meaningful aspects of my wedding just to soothe their egos when they'd never cared about my feelings for my entire life. James was supportive, reminding me that this was our wedding and we had the right to make it meaningful to us, not to perform traditions for people who hadn't earned them. Over the next few weeks, my parents tried various tactics to change my mind. They alternated between guilt trips and threats, between playing the victim and getting angry. My mother called crying multiple times, saying I was breaking her heart and she didn't know how she'd face her friends knowing she hadn't been included in her daughter's wedding properly. My father sent texts about how disrespected he felt, how I was choosing his parents over him as some kind of revenge, how I was tearing the family apart over my stubbornness. Neither of them ever acknowledged the history of favoritism or considered that maybe their own behavior had led to this situation. Vanessa got involved too, calling me to say I was being unfair to our parents, that I was making a big deal out of nothing, that I should just let Dad walk me down the aisle to keep the peace. I pointed out that Vanessa had never noticed the favoritism because she'd been the beneficiary of it her entire life, that she had no idea what it felt like to be constantly overlooked in favor of your sibling. She said I was being dramatic and holding grudges, that our parents had always loved both of us equally and I was choosing to see it differently. The conversation ended with me telling Vanessa that she had no right to judge my decision when she'd never experienced what I'd experienced. About 2 months before the wedding, after it became clear I wasn't going to change my mind about the processional, my parents' behavior took a vindictive turn. They apparently decided that if they weren't going to have the wedding they wanted, they would make sure I didn't have the wedding I wanted either. They began a campaign to sabotage my wedding by contacting guests and trying to convince them not to attend. I first learned about this when my cousin called me, confused and concerned. She said she'd received a message from my mother saying that the wedding was basically canceled, that there was serious family conflict and people should reconsider attending, that it would be better for everyone if the wedding was postponed until family issues were resolved. My cousin wanted to know what was going on and whether she should still plan to attend. I was absolutely stunned. My mother was actively trying to convince my own family members not to come to my wedding because she was upset about not getting the role she wanted. As I investigated further, I discovered the scope of their sabotage. My parents had contacted numerous guests on our invitation list, sending messages through social media, text, and email. The messages varied slightly but had consistent themes. The wedding was happening under difficult circumstances. There was major family drama. Attending would be choosing sides. It would be better for family harmony if people didn't attend. Some messages were more specific, painting me as ungrateful and disrespectful, claiming I was having the wedding as a way to hurt my parents, suggesting that attending would be supporting my campaign against them. I was absolutely devastated and furious. This wasn't just about them being upset about my decision anymore. This was active, malicious sabotage of one of the most important days of my life. They were willing to ruin my wedding, to humiliate me in front of our extended family and friends, to damage my relationships with other people, all because they couldn't handle not being the center of attention for once. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. James and I immediately went into damage control mode. We started calling and messaging guests ourselves, explaining what was actually happening. That my parents were upset about not having the traditional role in the wedding and had decided to try to sabotage the event by spreading false information. Most people were supportive once they heard our side, expressing disgust at my parents' behavior and confirming they would absolutely still attend. Some people admitted they'd been confused by my parents' messages but hadn't wanted to get involved in family drama. A few relatives, unfortunately, seemed to take my parents' side, sending messages about how I should respect my parents and maybe postpone the wedding to work things out. The most painful discovery was that my parents had also contacted James's family, sending them messages about what a difficult and disrespectful person I was, how I was tearing my family apart, how this wedding was happening under a cloud of hostility. They were trying to poison my relationship with my future in-laws, to make James's family question whether he should marry someone who treated her own parents so poorly. Fortunately, James's parents had already witnessed my parents' favoritism toward Vanessa and their general dismissiveness toward me, so they weren't swayed by the messages. They were, however, appalled by the attempt to manipulate them and reassured both James and me that they fully supported our marriage and our wedding decisions. I confronted my parents about the messages, calling them and asking point blank how they could try to sabotage my wedding like this. My father was unapologetic, saying that I had made it clear I didn't value them or want them at the wedding, so they were simply letting people know the truth about the situation. My mother said through tears that I had forced them to do this by being so hurtful and disrespectful, that if I had just made the traditional choice about who walked me down the aisle, none of this would be happening. They were somehow positioning themselves as victims defending themselves rather than aggressors actively trying to ruin my wedding. I made a decision in that conversation that was painful but necessary. I uninvited my parents from my wedding entirely. I told them that their behavior in trying to sabotage my wedding by turning guests against me had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that they were no longer welcome at the event, and that I would be informing security at the venue not to allow them entry. My father started yelling about how I would regret this, how I was destroying our family, how I'd be sorry when they were gone and it was too late to make amends. My mother was crying and saying I was the most ungrateful daughter anyone could have. I ended the call feeling shaky but certain I had made the right choice. Vanessa called me immediately after, having apparently been contacted by our parents about being uninvited. She was furious, saying I had gone too far, that uninviting our parents from my wedding was unforgivable, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I explained what our parents had done, the messages they'd sent trying to convince people not to attend, the attempts to sabotage the wedding. Vanessa's response was that I had driven them to desperate measures by being so unreasonable that if I'd just compromised and let Dad walk me down the aisle, none of this would have happened. I told Vanessa that she was welcome to skip the wedding too if she felt so strongly about defending our parents' indefensible behavior. She said she wouldn't attend a wedding where our parents weren't welcome, and I said that was her choice to make. The final weeks before the wedding were stressful as we dealt with the aftermath of my parents' sabotage and my decision to uninvite them. Some extended family members took sides, with a few deciding not to attend in solidarity with my parents. Others reached out to express their support and to share stories of their own observations of my parents' favoritism over the years, validating what I had experienced. My grandparents were heartbroken about the situation but steadfast in their support of me, saying they were honored to walk me down the aisle and that my parents had created this situation through their own behavior. We hired security for the wedding with specific instructions not to allow my parents, Vanessa, or a few other relatives who had indicated they might cause problems. We briefed our wedding party and close family members about the situation so they could help keep watch and alert security if needed. These precautions felt simultaneously necessary and absurd. The fact that I needed security to keep my own parents out of my wedding being a surreal reflection of how dysfunctional the situation had become. My wedding day arrived, and despite all the drama leading up to it, it was absolutely beautiful. The weather was perfect, the venue looked stunning, and almost all of our invited guests attended despite my parents' attempts to convince them otherwise. The fact that so many people showed up despite the sabotage attempts felt like a validation of my relationships with them and a rejection of my parents' manipulation. Getting ready that morning surrounded by friends and James's family, I felt loved and supported in a way I'd never felt around my own parents. The moment when my grandparents walked me down the aisle is one I'll treasure forever. They were both beaming with pride and joy, and I could see tears in their eyes as we walked together. Having them on either side of me felt right and meaningful in a way that having my father there never would have. They had earned this moment through decades of love and support, and I was grateful to be able to honor them in this way. Many guests later told me it was the most touching processional they'd ever witnessed, that the love between my grandparents and me was palpable and made the ceremony even more special. My parents did attempt to attend despite being uninvited. They showed up at the venue during the ceremony and tried to enter, claiming there must be a misunderstanding, that they were the bride's parents and of course they should be allowed in. Security handled it professionally, explaining that they were not on the approved guest list and escorting them off the property when they refused to leave voluntarily. I didn't learn about this until after the reception, which I'm grateful for because it meant my actual wedding day wasn't disrupted by their drama. The reception was joyful and full of love, exactly what I'd hoped for. My grandparents gave a toast that had everyone crying, talking about watching me grow up, being proud of the woman I'd become, and welcoming James into our family. Several guests commented that they'd never been to a wedding that felt so full of genuine happiness and authentic love. The absence of my parents, rather than creating a void, actually allowed the celebration to be about James and me and the people who genuinely cared about us, without the underlying tension their presence would have created. In the months since the wedding, my parents have made a few attempts to contact me, primarily through other family members since I blocked their numbers and social media. The messages have ranged from attempts at guilt tripping about how hurt they are that I excluded them from my wedding, to angry accusations that I've destroyed our family, to occasional hints at wanting reconciliation without actually apologizing for their behavior. I haven't responded to any of these attempts. As far as I'm concerned, they made their choices when they tried to sabotage my wedding, and I'm at peace with the natural consequence of those choices being the end of our relationship. Vanessa and I are also no longer in contact. She continues to maintain that I was wrong and cruel to our parents, unable or unwilling to see the lifetime of favoritism and neglect that led to my decisions. Her inability to understand or validate my experience, her automatic siding with our parents despite their sabotage attempts, confirmed that we never really had a genuine sibling relationship anyway. She was the favored child who benefited from our parents' unequal treatment, and she has no interest in acknowledging that reality or understanding how it affected me. My grandparents continue to be the wonderful, supportive presence in my life they've always been. Nana tells me regularly how honored she was to walk me down the aisle, how it was one of the most special moments of her life. Papa says he's never been prouder than he was watching me marry James. Their love and support have been unwavering through all of this, and I'm grateful every day that I had them in my life to provide what my parents never could. James and I are building our life together, free from my toxic family dynamics and surrounded by people who genuinely love and support us. We're expecting our first child next year, and we've already decided that my parents will not have a relationship with their grandchild. They'll never have the opportunity to show favoritism toward another generation, to make another child feel less important or less loved than their sibling. Our children will be raised with the kind of unconditional love and support my grandparents showed me, not the conditional affection and clear favoritism my parents demonstrated throughout my childhood. Looking back on everything that happened, I have no regrets about my decision to have my grandparents walk me down the aisle or about uninviting my parents when they tried to sabotage my wedding. These weren't choices I made lightly or out of spite. They were boundary-setting decisions based on decades of being treated as less important than my sister and a specific pattern of vindictive behavior when I finally stood up for myself. My parents had countless opportunities over my lifetime to build a genuine relationship with me, to show me I mattered to them, to treat me with the same love and attention they showered on Vanessa. They chose not to take those opportunities. And when I made wedding decisions that reflected the reality of our relationship, they chose sabotage over self-reflection. For anyone dealing with similar family dynamics, where you've been the overlooked or less favored child and are now facing pushback for setting boundaries or making choices that reflect that reality, I want you to know that you have the right to honor the people who actually showed up for you. You don't owe traditional roles or gestures to parents who didn't earn them through their behavior. You're allowed to build your important life moments around people who genuinely love and support you, even if those people aren't your biological parents. And you're allowed to protect your celebrations from people who would rather ruin them than accept consequences for their own actions. The narrative that blood family deserves automatic inclusion in your life regardless of how they treat you is toxic and needs to end. Real family is built through consistent love, support, and presence, not through biological accident. My grandparents are more my parents than my actual parents ever were, and having them walk me down the aisle wasn't a snub to my parents. It was an acknowledgement of reality and honoring of people who deserved to be honored. If my parents had wanted that role, they should have built the kind of relationship that would make them the natural choice for it. My name is Sophia. I'm 29 years old, and this is my story of how my parents neglected me my entire life in favor of my sister, how I chose my grandparents to walk me down the aisle instead of them, and how they tried to sabotage my wedding by messaging guests not to attend. It's been 7 months since my wedding, and I'm at peace with how everything unfolded. My wedding day was beautiful precisely because it was filled with people who genuinely loved me and free from people who had spent my lifetime making me feel less than. My parents lost their chance to be part of my life's important moments when they spent decades showing me I wasn't important to them. That's a consequence of their choices, not my cruelty. Thank you for listening to my story.